In January of 2010, in the year before the violent deposing of Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi, fellow leaders of member nations within the African Union gave Gaddafi a foreboding message. They voted not to renew his chairmanship of their Continental League of Nations, and they also rejected his push to establish a grandiose United States of Africa. Gaddafi's comments during the introduction of his successor were not optimistic. The political elite of our continent lacks political awareness and political determination. The world is changing into 7 or 10 countries, and we are not even aware of it. Apparently, it was Gaddafi himself who lacked political awareness. For, since his demise, African leaders have shown a renewed interest towards continental integration. Global development funding institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, now consider infrastructure projects for the African continent more attractive without having to deal with an eccentric, flamboyant, and unpredictable Gaddafi. Ethiopia, Nigeria, and South Africa, 3 nations that voted against Gaddafi's United States of Africa, favor a more manageable, incremental approach to regional integration. A former government official from South Africa, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, is now chairperson of the African Union Commission, and her former husband, South Africa President Jacob Zuma, today shows his enthusiasm for the project.
We thought it was important to divide Africa on 5 economic regions so that the task is manageable by each region in terms of the economic interests and development and how we look at the development of Africa.
Sure.
We have succeeded to do so. I think they are now well established. What therefore we are doing is how do we make these, because the idea was how will you begin from there in order to unite Africa at economic activities?
Right.
I think we've succeeded to do so. You will recall that not long time ago, last year, we established a free trade zone of 3 very big regional, economic regional organizations in the continent, SADC, including the 2 other regions, wherein half of the population of the continent is now working together.
Right.
That tells you we're moving forward. We are moving step by step. In fact, the last summit, which was there in January, began to discuss the amalgamation of all 5.
Yeah.
That is the plan that we are taking.
In one sense, however, Muammar Gaddafi was correct in his post-election assertion to his African Union comrades. One of the most significant geopolitical events in world history is indeed occurring today, and aside from open discussion among an elite few within international finance, business, government, and academia, most people in the world lack knowledge and concern about it. As Gaddafi observed, the African Union is not alone in its pursuit of regional integration. Gaddafi's assessment that 7 to 10 supernations are now emerging on the world scene is proving to be quite accurate.
Ali Rodríguez, cuenta con este pueblo para tu gestión tan importante al frente de la Unión de Naciones Suramericana, UNASUR.
I misread the bailouts and I could see the panic around this chamber, but you of course were calm through it all.
I've spoken before of the vision of a new Silk Road in which Afghanistan is firmly embedded in the economic life of a thriving South and Central Asia.
Russian President Vladimir Putin, in his address to General Assembly on December 17th, announced the creation of the Eurasian Union is the principal task of Russian foreign policy.
The summit will address plans aiming eventually at the establishment of a Gulf central bank and set a timetable for the monetary union.
Mr Van Rompuy, when you first appeared here in what proved to be a rather expensive speech, I said you'd be the quiet assassin of nation-state democracy. I thought it was just going to be a federal Europe, a federal union. But actually it appears, with every statement you make, that what you now want is the total subjugation of the states to completely undemocratic structures based in Brussels.
Now, today in this city, the presence of the European Parliament and the Council of Europe stand as symbols of a Europe that is united, peaceful, and free. The buildings that are now living monuments to European unity were not drawn from simple blueprints. They were born out of the blood of the first half of the 20th century and the resolve of the second.
Distributed in magazines and public displays in the early 1990s, this illustration was part of a campaign by the Council of Europe. This high-powered, multinational European organization was founded in 1949 to promote European integration and is now located in Strasbourg, France, along with the EU Parliament. The illustration portrays European integration as the rebuilding of the Tower of Babel with modern construction equipment. Below the tower is the slogan, "Europe, many tongues, one voice," an overt reference to Genesis 11 in the Bible. Regardless of one's take on that Bible story, its message is clear. Utopian central planning is not a very good idea given the human condition. The Council of Europe's premise, also reflected in the EU Parliament building in Strasbourg, is clear as well. It totally rejects the Genesis message. Today, the European Union remains the extolled prototype and the consensus model by which all the world's other regional blocs are being developed and measured. For the past several years, reports of the EU's demise have been greatly exaggerated. But there is a method to the madness. It's called the Monnet method. Jean Monnet, the so-called father of the European Union, led the drive for European integration after World War II.
Today's EU began in Paris in 1951 when Jean Monnet set up the European Coal and Steel Community, a club of 6 nations: France, West Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, Italy and the Netherlands.
In 1950, Jacques-René Rabier was working in Monnet's office.
Donc déjà, dans un document de Alger, août 1943, qui se trouve dans les mémoires de Monnet, il voyait déjà la création d'une Europe dans laquelle les Alliés, les Français, les Britanniques et les vaincus, les Allemands, seraient associés avec tous ceux qui voudraient s'y joindre dans une unité économique à vocation politique, anticipant sur une éventuelle ultérieure fédération européenne.
The Monnet method took only limited, incremental steps that would not trigger alarm from any member nation. Inherent in this limited scope was a Machiavellian end justifies the means process of crisis creation, wherein each solution brought a step toward deeper integration, bringing about yet another set of problems. Those problems had been anticipated along the way, but were nonetheless allowed or designed to occur in order to cause the motivation necessary to launch the next step. In recent years, this combination of deception and incremental psychological conditioning has brought the people of Europe to a bizarre mix of anger, gripping fear, and numbing indifference to the changes brought about by their officials. A prime example of this process is the recent European monetary crisis, which was not unexpected. After European nations embarked upon the derelict deficit spending policies of indoctrinated incompetence or of subversives, the resulting uncertainty, fear, chaos, and civil unrest prompted many to conclude that the EU would soon dissolve. To the contrary, the crisis has now resulted in the nations of Europe having to submit their national budgets to the EU for approval before they can be implemented.
The key lesson of the crisis was that Europe needed to build a closer economic union to complement its existing monetary union and to ensure that public finances are sustainable. First, the EU introduced new, stronger rules to keep a tighter check on public debt and deficits, to make sure countries don't spend beyond their means. We need sound public finances across Europe and solidarity mechanisms for crisis situations, a fiscal union. We need stronger supervision of the financial markets, a banking union. We need a deeper economic union with targeted investment to boost growth and competitiveness. It must emerge from this crisis stronger and more united than ever. A true political union with a reinforced European Parliament, a prosperous home for its 500 million citizens, and a strong player in the world.
This has resulted in EU central control that is even more powerful than the federal government of the United States, which has no authority to order the states to submit their budgets for approval. With the possible exception of Britain, European Union nations have now completely surrendered their sovereignty to the EU. This chain of events was perhaps best described in a Times of India op-ed of February 19, 2012. At that time, many believed the EU would split apart, but the writer accurately foresaw what is now a reality. The recent financial crisis has actually resulted in the deeper integration of the European Union. Entitled, Eurozone Crisis, Will It Create a United States of Europe? The column laid out a prominent thesis of Europe's Jean Monnet method. This thesis runs as follows. Our aim has always been to create a United States of Europe, bigger and stronger than the USA. However, this can only be done in stages, since national identities in Europe are very strong. The crafty way forward is to force the pace of European integration faster than the public wants. This will, of course, lead to crises, but every crisis will force voters to choose between greater unification and the huge costs of de-integration. Hopefully, they will repeatedly opt for greater unification. In the process, they will give up facet after facet of their national identity and culture. Our solution was Machiavellian. Go ahead with the unviable monetary union and let it cause a Eurozone crisis. Once this happens, we theorized, voters in both surplus and deficit countries would refuse to face the terrible consequences of abandoning the euro. Hence, they will agree to once unthinkable changes in their policies and attitudes to stave off collapse. British member of the European Parliament, Nigel Farage, who leads the Eurosceptic UK Independence Party, or UKIP, has confronted European officials with this very charge on the floor of the EU Parliament.
Well, Mr Van Rompuy, when you first appeared here in what proved to be a rather expensive speech, I said you'd be the quiet assassin of nation-state democracy. And sure enough, in your dull and technocratic way, you've gone about your course, but I have to say, you're even worse than I thought you were going to be. I thought it was just going to be a federal Europe, a federal union. But actually it appears, with every statement you make, that what you now want is the total subjugation of the states to completely undemocratic structures based in Brussels. I misread the bailouts. I thought that when the bailouts happened, and I could see the panic around this chamber, people fearing economic meltdown, but you of course were calm through it all because you saw the bailouts as your opportunity to take control. Just think how Ireland today is managed, Greece for that matter. The sinister sounding troika come in, 50 officials, spend a few days in the country, investigate the situation and then tell puppet prime ministers what they may or may not do. And I note great enthusiasm in this chamber for Spain to have a bailout. Lots of members here want Spain to accept the bailout so that they too are subjugated to this new order. Indeed, in Italy, the appointee there, Mr Monti, is very keen for his own country to be bailed out because, to quote him, he fears that parliamentary democracy could bring down the European Union. So I think it's pretty clear that your next phase is for those that haven't been bailed out and may not need to be bailed out. You now want them to sign guarantees, budget guarantees, and to have the power to strike down national budgets after they have been through Parliament. So it's odd against this backdrop that the Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to the European Union.
And here they come. All
the purpose of awarding the 2012 Nobel Peace Prize to the European Union was to rally the EU through its latest monetary crisis, and also to send a message to the world's other geopolitical regions that if Europe, and in particular, historic enemies France and Germany, could maintain and deepen its union despite a long history of wars and crises, the other global regions could as well. Of course, Europe could not have pioneered the region-building process without massive and continual foreign aid, including umbrella military security from the United States. From the time of the Marshall Plan after World War II, and throughout the early EU incubation period, U.S. aid to Europe has continued even to the present day. The EU has now assumed a leadership role in regulating and financing the further development of other regions. The EU has done this in part by pioneering much of the harmonized regional regulatory framework that must be then met by other nations in order to engage in commerce with the EU. This regulatory framework then forms the basis of those other nations' integration into their respective regions, since they are already committed to those regulations in their ongoing relationship with the EU. This backdoor approach can circumvent an impasse between rival nations within regions, and it pressures independent-minded nations to get in line with the integration process. This assures the EU of a commanding presence within this new regional order. Western international development banks and institutions such as the European-directed International Monetary Fund and US-led World Bank also shape the development of other regions by financing ambitious regional infrastructure projects within those regions. These loan packages dictate conditions and terms with obligations to promote integration among the recipients. This international loan shark process that has been used upon other regions has also been turned upon the European Union nations themselves. The EU monetary crisis was indeed created in this manner and has resulted in the direct oversight by these same banking interests. In this way as well, the European Union serves as a model for the future course of the world's regions.
And I have to say, Mr Van Rompuy, 18 months ago when we first met, I was wrong about you. I said you'd be the quiet assassin of nation-state democracy, but you're not anymore. You're rather noisy about it, aren't you? You, an unelected man, went to Italy and said this is not the time for elections, but the time for actions. What in God's name gives you the right to say that to the Italian people?
Thank you.
The central banks of Europe and the US, aided by the deficit spending policies of derelict politicians, can also create crises by manipulating money supplies.
Investors and non-investors alike are watching commodity prices soar in correlation to that money printing. Corn, wheat, copper, oil, you name it. And it's not just in those other countries. So whether you're cursing food and gas prices at home this summer and wondering why, or you're a stunned observer of the unrest in the Middle East, realize both are the direct result of a pay cut from money printing as your government remains hell-bent on propping up the megabanks.
Over the years, Europe's incremental Monnet method has been revealed in the steady strengthening and widening of the scope and titles of the organizations tasked with implementing the integration project. This order of progression is important to remember when studying the development of the world's other major geopolitical regions, as they have all generally followed the European incremental process. If imitation is the best form of flattery, a prime example is the regional project of Russian President Vladimir Putin.
This week in St. Petersburg, he asked European leaders to recognize his common economic space, the new customs union of Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan. In fact, the Customs Pact is considered a stepping stone in Putin's grander vision, the creation of a Eurasian Union with a common currency.
Putin's Eurasian Union is attempting to accomplish regional integration in a fraction of the 6 decades that it has taken the prototype EU to achieve. Even so, Russia and its Eurasian partners have followed Monnet's incremental path.
Russian President Vladimir Putin, in his address to General Assembly on December 17th, announced the creation of the Eurasian Union is the principal task of Russian foreign policy. The Eurasian Union includes Republic of Belarus, Kazakhstan and Russia. Integration model of the Eurasian project will make Russia a link between Europe and Asia. Treaty on the Eurasian Economic Union should be signed by January 1st, 2015.
After Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika, former Soviet Union nations agreed to a less than threatening Commonwealth of Independent States in 1991, with an emphasis on their independence. That, however, provided the forum for the establishment of a customs union, the Eurasian Economic Community, or Eurosec, in 2000, featuring freedom of movement without a visa within the member nations. This has led to a common economic space that pools production, monetary investment, and labor resources. The ultimate objective is the Eurasian Union, or EAU, with a common parliament, defense, foreign and domestic policy, and monetary currency by 2015. Russia's concern that it would become less significant between two powerful forces, the European Union to the west and China and the Orient to the east, is one of the main factors motivating the development of the Eurasian Union. Putin has strongly denied allegations that he is attempting to revive a semblance of the old Soviet Union. However, he is using a carrot and stick approach in an attempt to corral all of the former Soviet Union nations into Eurasian integration, promising reduced rates to access Russia's vast energy reserves and other incentives offered only to those nations that join. However, Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, and Moldova have balked at the plan and continue to hold talks with the EU on possible membership. These nations seem to be searching for any possible way to escape the reach of the Russian bear, but it seems inevitable that most will not. The urge of East Europeans to avoid another Soviet-style subjugation to Russia is understandable, but they will find no flight to freedom in the new EU.
The Soviet Union was governed by 15 unelected people who appointed each other and who were not accountable to anyone. The European Union is governed by 24 people who appoint each other, meet in secret, and whom we cannot sack.
Today I call for a federation of nation states.
In the Soviet Union, they
would not likely confirm it at this time. All of the world's regional blocs are now traversing at varying speeds through the chart stages toward an intended political integration. The governments of Australia and New Zealand published this chart to illustrate their study, published in April 2012, of a plan to integrate their two economies, including issuance of a common currency. Their conclusion was favorable to the possibility. Australia and New Zealand are both members of the Pacific Islands Forum. Though great in area, the PIF is the weakest of all of the regions that could be considered major blocs.
The Pacific Island Forum's geographic sphere of influence is massive, covering 30 million square kilometers. This area stretches from the Marshall Islands in the north to New Zealand in the south, from Australia in the west to Kiribati in the east. The impact and influence of the Pacific Islands Forum is evident in nearly every major regional development in the last 30 years. These include the emergence of the Forum as the premier political organization of the region with a well-established secretariat. The Forum's success in promoting regional cooperation and integration through trade has given the Forum members far greater influence in international affairs than they would have as individuals.
It is uncertain whether this region will remain a viable region or be dissolved into one or more of the neighboring regions, such as SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In 1973, the Club of Rome, an influential globalist think tank, proposed a 10-region global structure that had this region also containing South Africa, a fellow British Commonwealth member, along with Australia, New Zealand, and most of the PIF member island nations. The inclusion of South Africa, now a member of the BRICS Association of Emerging Industrial Nations, would have made this a more economically competitive region. However, since the fall of apartheid, South Africa has become engaged with the African Union, and the current chairperson of the African Union Commission is South African Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Even so, Australia-New Zealand integration is likely.
At a lunch of the who's who of big business, a single economic market was on everyone's lips.
There's great energy about this Trans-Tasman agenda and the single economic market. You watch, my prediction will be we'll get over the climate change issues.
And just to show that commitment, government ministers were bussed to the Australian Navy's Sydney base for a joint Australian-New Zealand cabinet meeting. This is the third visit to Australia by New Zealand's Prime Minister in just 9 months, but never before has any country been afforded such access to Australia's senior government ministers. Trade, defence and environment ministers were at the table, along with transport, tourism and perhaps not surprisingly, New Zealand's Minister for Rugby Union.
Such bilateral integration is not uncommon as a springboard to encompass neighbouring nations in a region and is another backdoor approach to circumvent any regional impasse. It also bears noting that even though the major regions and their locations are generally established, the member nation makeup of each region is a bit fluid, as has been apparent in Europe, Eurasia, and the South Pacific. This is reflective of populations and/or their rulers' personality conflicts, historical prejudices, and other considerations as they relate to ongoing integration efforts. In their determination to corral nations into various regional blocs, globalist negotiators will take the path of least resistance to do so. Such is the case with ASEAN, the 10-member association of Southeast Asian nations. The recent Obama administration Asia pivot is reflective of the uncertain, fluid nature of the regional interactions in East and South Asia. ASEAN includes all East Asian nations with 5 notable, non-aligned exceptions: Japan, China, Taiwan, South Korea, and North Korea. China is large enough and powerful enough to be its own region, and that may well become the case. China is the only nation within the emerging industrial BRICS group, consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that is not a dominant anchor nation within a regional bloc. Currently, China is fulfilling the role of antagonist to the Southeast Asian region, prompting a circle-the-wagons reaction toward integration among the ASEAN nations. Indeed, the crisis-creating antagonist has been employed to accelerate every regional integration effort since the Cold War's Soviet Union, and its Warsaw Pact first spurred the integration of the European community's common market. However, ASEAN and China have recently partnered up in a regional free trade agreement, and overtures have been extended to Japan and South Korea as well, in the form of ASEAN +3 discussions. Although not all free trade agreements evolve into geopolitical regions, all regions at some point embrace free trade agreements. However unlikely that a regional framework involving all of these nations may appear today, the recent awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to the European Union was meant to send a direct message to exactly such historical enemies as China, Japan, and the Korean Peninsula, as well as to SAARC member nations with historic enmity, India and Pakistan. That message is that if longtime enemies Germany and France can become regional partners, so can you. One projection of a final East Asian regional agreement foresees only Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan entering ASEAN, and China joining SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. Another scenario envisions a completely new Eastern Asia region apart from ASEAN, which may include the reunification of Taiwan with China, or of the Korean Peninsula, perhaps in the aftermath of an order-out-of-chaos crisis situation. As modern geopolitics has shown, long-time arrangements cannot be assumed to be set in concrete, especially since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It appears, however, that China is leaning more towards SAARC, despite some reservations from SAARC's current anchor nation, India, also a historic rival with China. Some officials in SAARC are courting China as a possible member, foreseeing that scenario as better for them than seeing China join ASEAN.
Over a number of years, we intend to build on this relationship in a staged way to a full force of around 2,500 personnel. That is a full marine, air, ground task force. A second component of these initiatives, which we have agreed, is greater access by US military aircraft to the Royal Australian Air Force facilities in our country's north. This will involve more frequent movements of US military aircraft into and out of Northern Australia.
Obama's Asia pivot is meant to bring American umbrella security into Southeast Asia, as all of the various regional arrangements there are sorted out, just as US umbrella security has remained in Europe throughout the decades of building the European Union. It is not accurate to say that American military and foreign aid policy since World War II has turned into mere nation building. It is more than that. For decades it has been, and remains to this day, region building. Region building is the ultimate in big government, big business central planning. But the benefits being presented for region building are illusory. Some would argue that it brings security among the nations within each of the world's regions, and that less distinct borders bring efficiency to multinational business and trade initiatives. However, the efficiency so desired by these big government, big business interests smacks of Mussolini fascism.
As industrialization was improved, Mussolini boasted that only he could make the trains run on time.
Consolidation of national governments into the hands of a few regional bureaucrats does not bring security. Rather, it results in a fascist repression of all people, as big government regulation, influenced by foundation finance monopolists and transnational corporate interests, stifle small business, free enterprise, and the independence of nations, both economic and political. Region building threatens security, since the nation-state is the ultimate check against governing powers' inevitable urge to consolidate and expand. Border security is meant to be somewhat cumbersome and redundant, as a check to anarchist, subversive behavior by populations, factions, and powers, both foreign and domestic. Liberty is more secure when jurisdiction is local and the state is distinct and sovereign, rather than becoming merely a branch office of a vast regional jurisdiction that controls an amalgamated area of similar branches. Another prime example of U.S. region building is with the Arab nations of the Persian Gulf, or, as those nations like to say, the Arab Gulf region. Their regional bloc is named the Gulf Cooperation Council, and it may well be the bloc furthest along the path to a regional political union, second only to the European Union.
The 30th Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, summit kicked off Monday in Kuwait City. During the two-day meeting, the leaders are expected to discuss a wide range of issues, including Dubai debt crisis and ratification of a monetary union agreement. The summit will address plans aiming eventually at the establishment of a Gulf central bank and set a timetable for the monetary union among 4 out of 6 members, as the UAE and Oman opted out of the currency union. The summit is also expected to inaugurate the first phase of Gulf electricity grid that will cover Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. The second phase will cover the UAE and Oman, as the third phase will see the linking of the two networks. GCC member states have implemented a series of strategies amid economic crisis, and the strengthened economic cooperation in the region helps countries maintain their economic stability under the impacts of financial crisis.
The GCC also is not wasting a good crisis to accelerate integration, as they take advantage of the motivation given them by the nation assuming the role of their chief antagonist, Iran.
The leaders of the 6 Arab Gulf states have been watching Iran and growing nervous. They've announced a plan to unite their military forces. Members of the Gulf Cooperation Council met in the Bahraini capital, Manama. They decided to bring their air, land, and marine forces under a single authority.
We agreed to set up a unified military command and focus our defense capacities to counter external threats.
Many Gulf states are ruled by Sunni Muslims, but Shias are staging anti-government campaigns in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. Governments in the region say Shia-dominated Iran is instigating the protests.
Massive amounts of military and infrastructure assistance and U.S. umbrella military security have been transferred to this group of nations, headed by Saudi Arabia. Western globalists and global development funding institutions are heavily pushing the region to take the final step to become the Arab Gulf Union. An announcement that the GCC nations are establishing their common currency could now come at any time. The Gulf currency would be the first regional currency in existence other than the EU's euro. There is no greater illustration of U.S. military and foreign aid region building than the operation over the past decade in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and their regional bloc SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. As infrastructure in U.S. cities is crumbling, American lives and billions of U.S. dollars are being spent to connect these countries into the infrastructure, commerce, and regulatory mindset of SAARC. The region-building infrastructure objective there is being called the New Silk Road.
I've spoken before of the vision of a new Silk Road in which Afghanistan is firmly embedded in the economic life of a thriving South and Central Asia. And we are delighted to see this vision coming to light through the Istanbul process and various regional trade and transit agreements.
The campaign to embed Afghanistan into SAARC has been a protracted mission in a volatile region, fraught with great risk both to the populations of the region and to the region builders themselves. It has been a bloody, gritty effort to regionalize nations with populations that wish to remain independent, but whose elitist leaders are being enticed with regional infrastructure deals and trade incentives. Political leaders and high commanders have taken advantage of the noble motives of those who have joined the U.S. military to win a war on terrorism. That mission has become, in reality, a war to eliminate resistance to region building. Americans have been given a classic bait and switch through the use of euphemisms and vague generalities. As America's sons and daughters train to fight terrorism, they are being instructed on how to disarm populations who resist the world community. They are being told that it is right to preemptively strike populations who have not attacked America, but who have leadership that the world would be a better place without. Once Americans discover that region building is the real objective of U.S. policy in Afghanistan and Central Asia, as well as in Africa and the Middle East, it also becomes apparent that globalism is not the inevitable process that has been portrayed in business and academic circles. Globalism is being forced upon the populations of the world as it drains the resources of the United States. Bill Clinton inadvertently admitted that globalism is being forced upon the world in a 2004 speech full of contradiction at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in which he intended to relate that globalism is just an inevitable course of world history.
All of human history is a story of increasing contact. We move from isolation to interdependence to integration, to an environment of shared benefits and responsibilities and values. Right now, globally, we have interdependence. It's good and bad. You all know why. We're struggling to get to integration. Most of you in this room want to lead the world in that direction. So our job is to move the world from interdependence to an integrated environment of shared benefits and responsibilities. The anti-globalization people think it's impossible, so they want to go from interdependence back to isolation. You can't do that. It's not physically possible. But a lot of their criticisms are right because we are caught in the middle between interdependence and integration. And if we just sit here and claim the benefits of interdependence without pushing the world into an integrated environment, which requires systematic change, not serial interesting things, we will find it is unsustainable and dangerous.
If globalism is so inevitable in the course of world history as Clinton implied, why does it need pushing? Why is it such a struggle? And why should we all be led in that direction? At least historian Ethan B. Kapstein, at the time director of studies at the Globalist Council on Foreign Relations, was more forthright than Bill Clinton and most other globalist proponents on the matter. Writing in the May-June 1996 CFR journal Foreign Affairs, Kapstein wrote, "For international economic integration is not some uncontrollable fact of life, but has deepened because of a series of policy decisions taken by the major industrial powers over the last 45 years. Growing income inequality, job insecurity, and unemployment are widely seen as the flip side of globalization. That perception must be changed if Western leaders wish to maintain the international system their predecessors created." It is important also to note that Bill Clinton used the term interdependence as an intermediary step to political integration, but conspicuously avoided the term independence as the original condition, and instead deceptively referred to it as isolation. Clinton's subtle deception and ad hominem stereotyping of any who would dare object to globalist integration is an old tactic of subversives and revolutionaries. Of course, isolation and independence are not synonymous. A nation can remain engaged with other nations in trade and dialogue, yet still maintain its right to defense and self-determination, without entering into collective security and trade pacts that sacrifice its sovereignty. Surely, in this age of digital conversion rates and Google Translate communications, a system of efficient global business transaction can be maintained without forcing nations to surrender their sovereignty for such a system as described by Kapstein, with vast regional regulatory and governance jurisdictions run by market manipulators and fascist-minded central planners who manage trade while acting under the guise of free trade. The Internationalist, a blog sponsored on the influential Globalist Council on Foreign Relations website, posted this November 2012 article that adds weight to the mounting evidence that U.S. forces are in the Middle East for umbrella security to enforce region building. The writer states the obvious, that the main reason for lack of regional integration in the MENA, Middle East North Africa area, is that these nations are among the strongest defenders of national sovereignty in the world. No doubt that attitude is motivated in large part by a religious fervor that will not accommodate Judeo-Christianity, but the ironic fact remains that these populations share this strong defense of national sovereignty with America's conservative Christians. In the poorer Arab League countries of the Middle East, grassroots Islam sees regionalism's underlying globalism as a product of Western secular influence. However, this very Islamic fervor, a major catalyst behind the Arab Spring uprisings, will also be the thread that is used to bind this Arab bloc. The kingdoms of the more affluent Arab Gulf region are relatively more bottom-line business-oriented than the poorer nations of the Arab League, and have been better able than most Arab nations to isolate themselves from the Arab Spring unrest due to their social programs funded by oil revenue. Grassroots Islam abhors the notion of compromising into the current globalist system, but does allow for a united Arab region as a means to launch a global Islamic empire. The globalist elite will not consider that scenario, but they will manipulate religious sentiment to strengthen the Arab League under Islamic law. The globalist objective is to allow a manipulated Arab Spring chaos to run its course to change the political landscape of the Middle East completely. Follow-up UN peacekeeping missions will then work to see that every government in the Arab League is cooperative towards the world order, following the example of the Arab Gulf region. The recent systematic deposing of the more pugnacious dictators in the Middle East and Africa is not indicative of a Western policy to spread democracy, as has been presumed by many. Not only have the governments replacing them not brought in the liberty and freedom as advertised, but al-Qaeda operatives were known to be a significant part of their power base. This regime change instead reflects a systematic policy to allow, in some governments, more Islamic sentiment to unify the region, and in others to replace leaders who are not team players in the new regional structure with more cooperative successors. Some, like Gaddafi, bought into the regional concept only so far as to unite resistance to the colonialist financiers of globalism. Gaddafi envisioned one Africa, but he wanted it to be his African Union, as evidenced by his audacious King of Kings proclamations. Economic hitman John Perkins explained how Saddam Hussein was deposed in Iraq.
Economic hitmen were not able to get through to Saddam Hussein. We tried very hard. We tried to get him to accept a deal very similar to what the House of Saud had accepted in Saudi Arabia, but he wouldn't accept it. And so the jackals went in to take him out. They couldn't do it. His security was very good. After all, he had one time worked for the CIA. He'd been hired to assassinate a former president of Iraq and failed, but he knew the system. So in '91 we send in the troops and we take out the Iraqi military. So we assume at that point that Saddam Hussein is going to come around. We could have taken him out, of course, at that time, but we didn't want to. He's the kind of strong man we like. He controls his people. We thought he could control the Kurds and keep the Iranians in their border and keep pumping oil for us. And then once we took out his military, now he's going to come around. So the economic hitmen go back in the 90s without success. If they'd had success, he'd still be running the country. We'd be selling him all the fighter jets he wants and everything else he wants. But they couldn't. They didn't have success. The jackals couldn't take him out again. So we sent the military in once again, and this time we did the complete job and took him out.
The order of these ousters in recent years is also eerily similar to the list of nations cited by retired General Wesley Clark back in 2007.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
An earlier outline of this strategy was promoted with the 2004 publication of the New York Times bestseller, The Pentagon's New Map, by Thomas P.M. Barnett.
I say what I do, and I think what this office does, this Office of Force Transformation needs to do, is think about the future of warfare within the context of everything else. And I think the everything else becomes more and more important as we understand this global war on terrorism within the larger context of the spreading of globalization. So here we go.
The book became a bestseller with help from favorable media coverage, including C-SPAN broadcasts of Barnett's brash PowerPoint presentations with audiences full of military, foreign policy wonks. On his new map of the globe, Barnett reveals this global conflict as a struggle between 2 major groups of nations or regions. The bloc that the United States belongs to, as part of North America, mind you, is what Barnett described as the functioning core of globalism. It consists of North America, Europe, Russia, Japan, China, India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Resisting this globalized power structure is a group of non-integrating gap regions, composed of the Caribbean area, most of Africa, the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the southern corners of Asia. The gap refers to its appearance as a large gap between the areas of the core, stretching around the globe at approximately the mid-latitude regions. A nation or region's integration into the functioning core denotes acceptance of certain core beliefs of globalization, according to Barnett. Barnett's willingness to compromise free human rights in order to advance globalism is evident in his list of allies that includes what he calls the newest pillars of the core: China, Russia, and Mexico, countries with long histories of corruption and human rights violations. An astute review by religious writer David Bay in his current events commentary of March 12, 2011, summed up Barnett's new map with this statement: "Once you understand this reality, that some countries and regions are lagging behind the rest of the world in being incorporated into the global economy and government, and need to be boot-kicked into fully joining the world body, you will understand why we are now at war, and why we will keep on going to war, from the Middle East to the Korean Peninsula, to Indonesia, to Pakistan, to Cuba, to Somalia, Kenya, the Ivory Coast, Saudi Arabia, and to East Timor." Perhaps no regional jurisdiction will be as vast as the one planned for the entire continent of Africa. Currently, the African Union is such in name only. Its aspiration to One Africa will be such a monumental task that the continent has been divided into subregions in order to bring it about. Only after these subregions of nations are integrated themselves will they then be federated into one continental jurisdiction, with a continental parliament, court system, military, and common currency. Meanwhile, the African subregions themselves are moving at varying stages through the 5 stages of regional integration. The East African Community appears to be leading the way and is on the verge of becoming a federated union of 5 nations. The region had announced that it would establish a common currency soon, but that may be delayed until the regional infrastructure is more firmly established. In Africa, it is Western colonialism that plays the role of the antagonist that spurs continental union. But the irony is that Western nations and financial institutions, ostensibly in competition with China, are the main organizations providing the resources for African integration, under the same globalist loan shark conditions that were described by economic hitman John Perkins.
Remember, it is to prepare for sending in an African intervention force to allow Mali to recover its territorial integrity, in line with the resolutions of the UN Security Council. Paris wants to hand over command of the mission as soon as possible to a force promised by the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. That force is supposed to receive European Union training, which is expected to take some time.
As with Central Asia and the Middle East, the African Union region-building process is being met with much resistance that will take years to eliminate. And once again, the U.S., along with European Union nations and NATO, has been called upon to provide military support. U.S. military presence thus far has been in an advisory and logistics role, supporting United Nations mandates for the African Union and the sub-regional forces.
Ali Rodríguez, cuenta con este pueblo para tu gestión tan importante al frente de la Unión de Naciones Suramericana, UNASUR.
UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, is employing the same motive for regional integration as the African Union, namely a defiance of European colonialism and U.S. hegemony in the Southern Hemisphere. The recent UNASUR backing of Argentina's resistance to British control of the Falkland Islands, off the Argentine coast, is a case in point. But like the African Union, UNASUR still needs investment from their designated antagonists and their loan shark international bankers to achieve their goal. Hence, reaction to integration efforts in South America has brought a mix of encouragement and interference from international financiers and world leaders as they work to steer South American integration into cooperation with a global network. The leading voices in the South American integration movement, all outspoken socialists, have been stricken with illness in recent years. Nestor Kirchner, one-time president of Argentina, then became president of UNASUR before he succumbed to cancer. Brazil's populist president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, left office also with cancer at the end of 2010, but his improved health has generated talk that he could become UNASUR president in 2013. But the most bombastic UNASUR advocate was Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, who died of cancer in March. The next generation of South American leaders will oversee UNASUR's absorption of a handful of sub-regional organizations, including Mercosur, Southern Common Market, ALBA, Bolivarian Alliance for Peoples of Our America, CAN, Andean Community, and perhaps even CARICOM, Caribbean Community. Mercosur has been performing South American trade functions apart from UNASUR's political emphasis, but is expected to be brought under the UNASUR umbrella in the near future. As corroborating, irrefutable evidence continues to mount, documenting region-building efforts throughout the world, it dispels any notion that the accounts of region-building in North America should be dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Evidence of the intent to integrate North America is also irrefutable, and is supported by comparing the objectives of North American integration with the objectives found in other regions. This comparison reveals that, at varying stages, all of these geopolitical regions, including North America, are pursuing the same region-building objectives, including harmonization of trade, customs, and industry regulations among the nations within each region, integrated regional infrastructure, including regional power grids, pipelines, and highways, integrated regional courts, tribunals, parliaments, and regulatory agencies that supersede national jurisdictions, integrated military and law enforcement, with intelligence information sharing, ostensibly to fight terrorism and crime that transcends national borders. Outer security perimeters, modeled after the European Union's Schengen zone, within which there is to be a free flow of cargo, services, and people among the nations within each regional perimeter. And economic and monetary integration, up to and including a common currency in each region, in accordance with the 5 stages of economic integration. In reviewing these objectives, it is important to keep in mind that some of these regions have by now openly stated their ultimate goal of political integration.
Our 3 nations are launching a new effort to get rid of outdated regulations that stifle job creation. Here in the United States, our efforts to cut red tape and ensure smart regulations will help achieve savings and benefits to businesses, consumers, and our country of more than $100 billion. And we're already working to streamline and coordinate regulations with Canada and Mexico on a bilateral basis. So now our 3 nations are going to sit down together, go through the books, and simplify and eliminate more regulations.
At the NAFTA 20 summit, Mexico's ambassador to the U.S., Arturo Sarocon, revealed the globalist strategy to use multinational trade agreements to backdoor deeper regulatory integration into the NAFTA region.
Least in Canada and in the United States today, to go down the route of deepening NAFTA. The beauty of TPP is that it allows us to do this through the back door. Why? Because by having Mexico, Canada, and the United States join the TPP negotiations, it will bring us up from the bootstraps and through the back door. It modernizes NAFTA by bringing NAFTA up on issues like IPR, environmental standards, labor, state-owned enterprises. It brings our trade infrastructure up to a, in many ways, NAFTA was a 1.0 free trade agreement. TPP is a 3.0 free trade agreement. And when our dear friends and colleagues on Capitol Hill box therapy about, oh, buy American, what we have to tell them is, you're wrong. We should be buying North America. Our exports no longer have a passport. They're truly North American exports.
Some 90% of all our trade, more than $1 billion in trade every single day, passes through our roads, our bridges, and our ports. But because of old systems and heavy congestion, it still takes too many products too long to cross our borders. And for every business, either Canadian or American, time is money. So we're going to improve our infrastructure.
Canada's oil is helpful in the world market, but the United States has the resources to achieve energy independence without it. Pipelines are essential for a nation's economic independence, but Obama's eventual okay of the Keystone XL pipeline must be seen as part of the push for the regional infrastructure of North America, as globalist Mitt Romney's bait-and-switch campaign slogan indicated. Similarly, the TAPI pipeline will aid Afghanistan's New Silk Road integration into the South Asian region, SAARC.
Welcome to the second session of the 39th Legislative Assembly
of the province of Manitoba. Manitoba is also taking a major role in the development of a mid-continent trade corridor, connecting our northern port of Churchill with trade markets throughout the central U.S. and Mexico. To advance the concept, an alliance has been built with business leaders and state and city governments spanning the entire length of the corridor. When fully developed, the trade route will incorporate an inland port in Winnipeg with pre-clearance for international shipping.
This New York Times article from 2004 describes the little-known chapter in the 1993-94 NAFTA agreement that established NAFTA tribunals that were given power to overturn U.S. Supreme Court commerce decisions. The article suggests that this was overlooked by Congress, but it must be asked, were Presidents Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, and Gerald Ford, along with members of Congress who pushed NAFTA, really that ignorant of its content? Or were they, in reality, that subversive?
For a president accused of not getting out the big artillery in support of the North American Trade Agreement, how about this? Down the hall to the White House East Room he came with 3 of his predecessors in tow. They were there for the signing of side deals to the trade agreement. But the real effort by Mr. Clinton today was to say to doubters that he's prepared to fight for the treaty, which is in trouble in Congress. Mr. Bush, whose administration negotiated the deal, said failure to ratify it would smack of anti-Mexican bias in the U.S. President Carter, without mentioning him by name, strongly attacked Ross Perot, who's been leading a campaign against the treaty.
We have a demagogue who has unlimited financial resources.
Gerald Ford warned Congress the treaty's failure would intensify the stream of illegal Mexican aliens crossing the U.S. border.
Don't gamble. If you defeat NAFTA, you have to share the responsibility for increased immigration to the United States, where they want jobs that are presently being held by Americans.
The NAFTA tribunals reveal the extent to which globalists in America will go to discard the U.S. Constitution in order to deepen U.S. integration into a regional jurisdiction. This means compromising the greatest human rights document produced by any nation in the world, the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights, that recognizes those unalienable, non-revocable human rights of the Declaration of Independence, over which governments have no jurisdiction. The U.S. Constitution is to be compromised through integration with Mexico and Canada, nations whose definition of human rights aligns with that of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That UN document clearly declares that human rights can be given, taken away, or limited by big government. A final observation from Bill Clinton's 2004 speech at Davos reveals his determination to complete a global integration that is the ultimate big government system.
Caught in the middle between interdependence and integration. And if we just sit here and claim the benefits of interdependence without pushing the world into an integrated environment, which requires systematic change.
Just what is the systematic change that Clinton points to? During the NAFTA debate in 1993, Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State in the Nixon and Ford administrations, provided a clue when he declared his support for NAFTA in this Los Angeles Times op-ed. NAFTA will represent the most creative step towards a new world order taken by any group of countries since the end of the Cold War. NAFTA is not a conventional trade agreement, but the architecture of a new international system. And years later, Mexican President Vicente Fox, never at a loss for words, explained Kissinger's new international system. In recent years, a new international system has been developing, oriented towards the establishment of norms and principles of universal jurisdiction above national sovereignty. Hence, Fox's system of universal jurisdiction above national sovereignty is consistent with Kissinger's New World Order and Clinton's systematic change. Fox continued, "Eventually, our long-range objective is to establish with the United States, but also with Canada, our other regional partner, an ensemble of connections and institutions similar to those created by the European Union, with the goal of attending to the freedom of movement of capital, goods, services, and persons." Thus, a North American version of Europe's Schengen zone that erases national borders can become the globalist reality, while NAFTA tribunals declare authority above the sovereignty of the United States Constitution. Bill Clinton's national security advisor during the NAFTA debate, Anthony Lake, parroted this mindset in a 1993 memo that would have been useful in that debate, but alas, it wasn't declassified until 1996. He wrote, "NAFTA institutions can be forged into the vital mechanisms of hemispheric governance, increasingly integrated by economic exchange and shared political values." Today in the U.S., the latest economic crisis, a fiscal cliff, has not been averted. It has just been kicked down the road once again by a Congress that borrowed billions more in deficit spending to delay the fall, and all the while foreign aid for global region building continues unabated. Clearly, this fiscal cliff was the result of dereliction in Washington. But this dereliction is not only because of mere incompetence, stalemate from blind adherence to a polarizing political philosophy, or payback from ambitious politicians to some obviously greedy, power-hungry special interests. All of the above is certainly true, but the real problem in Washington is that many of these politicians from both major political parties, along with their special interest backers, are also collaborators in the Monet method in North America. Their aim is to incrementally erode confidence in national economies, currencies, and sovereignty, to be superseded by their big government utopian dream, a new world order of federated geopolitical regions. Guy Verhofstadt is an influential and outspoken member of the European Union Parliament, and is a frequent heckler of Nigel Farage in that EU body. In October 2001, while Verhofstadt was the Prime Minister of Belgium, he called for a global federation of current geopolitical regions, patterned after the EU model. Now, this does not mean a one-world government or a one-world currency is imminent. In the incremental, pragmatic world of the globalists, that monolithic idea is unrealistic and unsustainable, at least in the near term. It is hard enough these days to herd independent-minded nations into the various geopolitical regions of the world. Current talk of world government only plays into the hands of those who cite such rhetoric to discredit the exposure of their immediate objective, which is the deeper integration of nations within multilateral regional trade organizations. Even now, these regional organizations are being incrementally transformed into political jurisdictions following the pattern of the EU from its days as the European Common Market. Indeed, world government talk is being used as an antithesis, a way out opposite, to the nation-state thesis, the current perceived reality, when confusing and diverting attention from the desired synthesis, the real goal of a regional structure. Such was a tactic, once again, of Henry Kissinger in his January 12, 2008 New York Times op-ed, "The Chance for a New World Order." Kissinger wrote that the then-new Obama administration would represent a unique opportunity to transform the 2008 economic crisis into a vision of hope by spearheading the development of a grandiose international political regulatory system, governance by global regulation of national policies and economies, a de facto world government. But if protectionism grows, he continued, such a return to mercantilism and 19th century diplomacy would divide the world into competing regional units with dangerous long-term consequences. "Ah, shucks," says Henry, feigning regret. The world would then have to settle for not the current nation-states, mind you, but the emergence of competing regional units, the synthesis objective that had been planned all along, and for which the infrastructure is currently being built. 2 steps forward for globalism, 1 back. This regional network is to come complete with Kissinger's 1984-like mercantilist created crisis scenario of mutually designated antagonist regions that will push each other to even deeper integration and central control. This is the very diversion process that Richard N. Gardner projected in his Hard Road to World Order article in the Globalist Council on Foreign Relations journal Foreign Affairs in April 1974. The hope for the foreseeable future lies not in building up a few ambitious central institutions of universal membership, like the United Nations, and general jurisdiction as was envisaged at the end of the last war, World War II, but rather in the much more decentralized, disorderly, and pragmatic process of inventing or adapting institutions of limited jurisdiction and selected membership. Kissinger's competing regional units completely fit Gardner's diversion description. Today's emerging regional units, built in large part by U.S. foreign aid, now serve as a designated antagonist to U.S. security and prosperity, prompting the globalist mantra that North America itself must accelerate integration to keep up with the competition. Gardner continued, "In short, the house of world order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. It will look like a great booming, buzzing confusion, to use William James's famous description of reality, but an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault." This ruse is continued by Robert Pastor, author of The North American Idea, and co-author of the Council on Foreign Relations sponsored Building a North American Community. Pastor has continually stressed that he favors a North American community rather than a North American Union, apparently betting that a naive American public would not discover that the community moniker not only had a place in the succession of titles towards the European Union, but had been an incremental step towards other geopolitical regions and subregions as well. For years, Pastor's Center for North American Studies at American University promoted a student-led triumvirate. This model North American Parliament was presented at universities and forums throughout the continent. Indeed, Pastor himself is a de facto follower of the relative truth Monnet method, the crisis-creating incremental process by which Jean Monnet, the father of the European Union, could deny favoring a European political union with a common currency, when that was not his near-term goal at the time. In reality, Monnet was a deceiver, just as many of our politicians and advocates of Pastor's North American Idea are today. Globalists commonly offer the following as some interrelated examples of threats that they say can only be overcome by regional integration, as these threats transcend national borders. These include terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering, trafficking of humans in the sex and slave trade, gun running, and climate change, a generic term aimed at minimizing scientific dissent as occurred with the term global warming or the global cooling scare of the 1970s. Never mind that all of these threats are increased in large part by the complicity, dereliction, fabrication, and exaggeration of politicians. Forget that, and just be afraid that all of a sudden in the 21st century, nations are inadequate for the task, and the only answer for dereliction in national governments is an even larger regional government umbrella. Increasingly, plans offered to combat threats such as these will be sold to the public in a regional structure, including regional law enforcement, defense, surveillance, and intelligence. Action plans emanating from the United Nations address all of these problems in such a manner. An example of this approach is the globalist obsession to get guns out of the hands of average citizens. Again, never mind that governments and their contractors are the chief culprits in arming the most despicable despots and their band of criminals. The UN's Program of Action to Combat and Eradicate the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects is the master plan produced from a July 2001 New York City conference. Among the global gun control measures in this UN action plan was a section devoted to the steps to be taken within the regions and subregions, with the aim of concluding relevant legally binding instruments aimed at preventing, combating, and eradicating the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons. In other words, their aim is to give the regions legislative and law enforcement powers. Paragraph 27 includes networks for information sharing among law enforcement, Border, and Custom Control Agencies, which is the exact result of the recent Obama-Harper Beyond the Border Action Plan for the U.S. and Canada.
We are agreed, for example, that the best place to deal with trouble is at the continental perimeter, that smarter systems can reduce the needless inconvenience posed to manufacturers and travelers by multiple inspections of freight and baggage.
Outer security perimeters surrounding each region are modeled after the European Union's Schengen zone, allowing for a free flow of cargo, services, and people among the nations within each regional perimeter. Only in this context does the motive for congressional and presidential dereliction in U.S. border security over the past several decades become clear. Such dereliction opens the door for the terrorism and the drug crime chaos pretext that will encourage public acceptance of the regionally integrated law enforcement, military, and intelligence. The Fast and Furious gun-running operation that further empowered Mexican drug gangs is a prime example of this chaos methodology.
The political agenda, again, being stopping guns from going into Mexico because the Mexican government, what is the political agenda?
Their political agenda behind this entire thing was to blame American gun shops for cartel violence in America in order to push an anti-Second Amendment, more regulations on these gun shops.
So that gets a little bit more complicated. You're into the conspiracy thing now, just not the hardware thing about it, that this was a design thing to blame gun shops and try to get Second Amendment rights curtailed.
Well, it's not a conspiracy, it's a fact. We have emails in the book, documentation. The goal from the beginning was force these gun shops in Arizona to sell to these straw purchasers that had been under surveillance. They knew they were the bad guys. They knew they were working for the cartels for a year. And then don't track the guns. They didn't put any tracking devices on the guns. Out of 2,500 guns, Bill, 2 guns had GPS devices put on them. So you tell me if that shows they wanted to really track these guns.
So you see nefariousness from the jump in this.
Zambata Nebla claims that under a divide-and-conquer strategy, the U.S. helped finance and arm the Sinaloa cartel through Operation Fast and Furious in exchange for information that allowed the DEA, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and other federal agencies to take down rival drug cartels. The Sinaloa cartel was allegedly permitted to traffic massive amounts of drugs across the U.S. from 2004 to 2009, during both Fast and Furious and the Bush-era gun-running operations, as long as the intel kept coming. And there is more. Based on the alleged agreement, the Sinaloa cartel, under the leadership of the defendant's father, Ismael Zambata Nebla, and Chapo Guzman, were given carte blanche to continue smuggling tons of illicit drugs into Chicago and the rest of the United States. They were also protected by the United States government from arrest and prosecution in return for providing information against rival cartels, which helped Mexican and United States authorities capture or kill thousands of rival cartel members. States in motion filed for discovery in United States District Court by Zambata Nebla's attorney in July of 2011. So what you need to know is that members of Congress from both parties should now say, look, let's demand to see everything, every single file connected to Fast and Furious and Operation Gunrunner. That means Republicans should not be focused only on the years when the Obama administration had control. Rather, go back to the beginning during the Bush administration.
When you realize that the federal government has essentially been arming these cartels, what goes through your mind?
We feel it's a betrayal. 42,000 people have been killed. And we also now have our hero in the Border Patrol, as you know, Agent Brian Terry, killed on American soil. 3 guns have been found at the murder scene. All 3 of them were connected to this program.
I want to read something that you said, or quoted as saying, if somebody gives a gun to somebody knowing they're going to commit murder, guess what we call them? We call them accomplices. Do you think the ATF have been accomplices to murder?
Absolutely.
So you're saying what they were doing was criminal?
Absolutely. Not just these individual agents, but people up the chain of command who have made the decision.
It is already well established that officials in other regions have now publicly stated their goal of deeper political and monetary integration with a common currency for their respective regions. However, North American globalists, at least those in the U.S., have adhered to their Monet Method template. They have, for the most part, withheld that objective from the public. With a leveraged dollar still funding much of the world's region building, and with much of the American public still stubbornly independent-minded, albeit complacent, any premature indication of globalists' plans could crumble the economic and political Tower of Babel they are constructing. Some leaks of their intent have occurred, however. Among the mass of government documents released by WikiLeaks was this 2005 email from Paul Cellucci, U.S. Ambassador to Canada during the George W. Bush administration. Designated sensitive but unclassified, not for distribution outside USG, U.S. government channels. The email reviewed input he was receiving from Canadian financial, business, and academic leaders on how best to proceed towards North American integration, including the prospects for a common currency. Along with comments advocating the now adopted continental security perimeter and others favoring Monet's incremental approach, Cellucci accounts the comments of the governor of the Canadian Central Bank, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve Chairman of the United States. Cellucci writes, "The central bank governor has taken the position that monetary union is an issue that should be considered once we have made more progress toward establishing a single market. That day of a North American single market is fast approaching, as these globalists are working hard to build the infrastructure, both physical and regulatory mechanisms, to support deeper political and monetary integration." Although rulers throughout the ages have dreamed of a global empire, a quest for a global federation did not begin in earnest until Victorian Britain's Round Table groups proposed a Commonwealth of Nations. Today, the Commonwealth is known as merely a forum of nations formerly administered by the British Empire, but it originally was meant to be something far greater, as it started the drive toward today's regional framework.
As a teenager, I heard John Kennedy's summons to citizenship. And then, as a student at Georgetown, I heard that call clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley.
Carroll Quigley was Rhodes Scholar President Bill Clinton's globalist mentor as a noted history professor at Washington's Georgetown University when Clinton was a student there. Quigley detailed the development and objectives of the Round Table groups as part of his voluminous macro-historical text published in 1966, Tragedy and Hope, as follows. Cecil Rhodes fervently exploited the diamond and gold fields of South Africa. With financial support from Lord Rothschild and Alfred Bate, he was able to monopolize the diamond mines of South Africa as De Beers Consolidated Mines. In the middle 1890s, Rhodes had a personal income which was spent so freely for his mysterious purposes. These purposes centered on his desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. For this purpose, Rhodes left part of his great fortune to found the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world. Rhodes and William T. Stead organized a secret society of which Arthur Lord Balfour, Lord Rothschild, and others were listed as potential members of a circle of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, later organized by Alfred Milner as the Round Table Organization. In 1909 through 1913, they organized semi-secret groups known as Round Table groups. In 1919, they founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. Similar institutes of international affairs were established in the chief British dominions and in the United States, where it is known as the Council on Foreign Relations. Carroll Quigley's research as a historian at Georgetown and Harvard, and his enthusiasm for the globalist cause, gained the confidence of sources within this movement in the United States. These sources allowed Quigley access to the historical records that were cited in Tragedy and Hope. Quigley's book was not meant to be an exposé of the nefarious activities of the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, or its part in the semi-secret Anglophile network, but as a record for posterity of what he believed to be their grand effort, as he explained. I know of the operation of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims and have, for much of my life, been close to it and many of its instruments. I have objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, but in general my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known.
But it's good to have an outpost of the Council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the Council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing. And
it's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
Quigley wrote that the Roundtablers would allow portions of the British Empire, presumably Canada among others, to become part of a greater American Union in return for U.S. participation in their World Federation. From 1884 to about 1915, the members of this group worked valiantly to extend the British Empire and to organize it in a federal system. They also hoped to bring the United States into this organization to whatever degree was possible. Steed was able to get Rhodes to accept, in principle, a solution which might have made Washington the capital of the whole organization, or allow parts of the empire to become states of the American Union. It is not surprising, therefore, that today's call for a North American community, being advanced by executive fiat with the U.S.-Canada Beyond the Border Agreement and its North American Security Perimeter, is being promoted chiefly by the Council on Foreign Relations and its representatives. Neither is it surprising that Rhodes scholar Bill Clinton would be groomed by that globalist institution to promote the pushing of the world's independent nations into an economic, political network of interdependence and integration. As fellow globalist and CFR spokesman Richard Gardner wrote in the CFR journal Foreign Affairs in April 1974 entitled "The Hard Road to World Order," the globalist network would have to make an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. Clinton's audacious ego is certainly consistent with the Rhodes Roundtable tradition. The extent to which the Roundtable moguls were full of themselves was revealed in their audacity to believe that their English ruling class had assumed divine authority to rule a global federation. Their disdain for other races' capacity to govern themselves was evidenced by Roundtabler Lionel Curtis, as quoted in Tragedy and Hope. Personally, I regard this challenge to the long unquestioned claim of the white man to dominate the world as inevitable and wholesome, especially to ourselves. The world is in the throes which precede creation or death. Our whole race has outgrown the merely national state, and as surely as the day follows night, or night the day, will pass either into a commonwealth of nations or else to an empire of slaves. And the issue of these agonies rests with us. These men had formed their intellectual growth at Oxford, on Edwin Burke's On Conciliation with America, and on the New Testament's Sermon on the Mount. The last was especially influential on Lionel Curtis. He had a fanatical conviction that with the proper spirit and proper organization, local self-government and federalism, the kingdom of God could be established on earth. When Lord Lothian died in Washington in 1940, Curtis published a volume of his speeches and included the obituary which Grigg had written for the Round Table. Of Lothian this said, "He held that men should strive to build the kingdom of heaven here upon this earth, and that the leadership in that task must fall first and foremost upon the English-speaking peoples." Contrary to Quigley's account, the Machiavellian means by which this aristocratic network would attempt to achieve its goal could not be said to be consistent with the Sermon on the Mount. There does exist, and has existed for a generation, before the 1960s, an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the Roundtable groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the Communists or any other group, and frequently does so. David Rockefeller, CFR honorary chairman and once longtime chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, has confirmed this Roundtable sentiment many times. Rockefeller has gushed praise upon the efficient administration of Mao's Communist China that slaughtered an estimated 40 million Chinese, and other authoritarian regimes as being a strong point for investment. The authoritarian, elitist nature of the Roundtable network is further evidenced by the fact that Cecil Rhodes' role model throughout his life was a man named John Ruskin. As Quigley noted, until 1870, there was no professorship of fine arts at Oxford, but in that year, thanks to the Slade bequest, John Ruskin was named to such a chair. He hit Oxford like an earthquake. Ruskin spoke to the Oxford undergraduates as members of the privileged ruling class. He told them that they were the possessors of a magnificent tradition of education, beauty, rule of law, freedom, decency, and self-discipline, but that this tradition could not be saved, and did not deserve to be saved unless it could be extended to the lower classes in England itself, and to the non-English masses throughout the world. Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. His inaugural lecture was copied out in longhand by one undergraduate, Cecil Rhodes, who kept it with him for 30 years. Ruskin was a prominent socialist of his time, whose sense has been widely interpreted by the academic aristocracy as a man with compassion for the poor, downtrodden masses, and for wanting to improve their lives by remaking society. However, the core of his belief was elitist to the point of advocating authoritarian subjection of those he perceived to be inferior, for their own good, of course, as he himself summed up in his compilation of papers published in 1860, Unto This Last. If there be any one point insisted on throughout my works more frequently than another, that one point is the impossibility of equality. My continual aim has been to show the eternal superiority of some men to others, sometimes even of one man to all others, and to show also the advisability of appointing such persons or person to guide, to lead, or on occasion even to compel and subdue their inferiors according to their own better knowledge and wiser will. My principles of political economy were all summed in a single sentence. Government and cooperation are in all things the laws of life, anarchy and competition the laws of death. It is no wonder that Ruskin's authoritarian, anti-competition teachings were embraced by the monopolist Rhodes and his group, as well as by the eugenics movement in England, the rise of which paralleled and intertwined with the Round Table movement within the British aristocracy. Eugenics, a proactive social Darwinism, enforced and accelerated Darwin's survival of the fittest. Darwin also was a Victorian elitist, and took Ruskin's authoritarian improvement of humanity into the dangerous realm of the biological. Today, it has been developed into transhumanism, the effort to fuse man and technology. The most disconcerting aspect to all of this was the elitist audacity to assume godhood and impose their English ruling class tradition throughout the world. Indeed, the religious element of this perfectibility of man was also in vogue in Victorian England during the late 1800s, particularly with the presence of occult practices in high society, paying homage to the serpent's perceived enlightenment that ye shall be as gods. Not surprisingly, Ruskin himself was a key figure in this development. Ruskin was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, as were Alfred Lord Tennyson, Arthur Balfour, Prime Minister 1902 to 1905, and William Gladstone, Prime Minister 1865 through 74. The SPR attracted many within British intellectual circles who had an interest in investigating the scientific credibility of paranormal activities. As an educator, Ruskin was noted for his emphasis in Romanticism and Gothic artistry. It was in this monastic, pantheistic nexus with naturalism, and the SPR's attempt to rationalize the spirit world, that Ruskin dwelled. Since art symbolism was of great importance to Ruskin, there is perhaps no better summation of Ruskin's life than the symbolism on his gravestone. Among the various esoteric symbols, the most striking is the swastika separating his birth and death years. Before Hitler made the swastika an obvious symbol of evil, it had been used for ages as a sun symbol in the occult and Eastern religions. It also symbolized good fortune, but like the yin-yang, the occult believed its force could also be utilized by the dark side. Indeed it was during that same late 1800s time period by such groups as Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. The Theosophical Society was openly Luciferian and used the swastika in many of its publications. Like all occult philosophies, both white and dark, Theosophists promoted the idea of the ascendancy of man toward godhood through various rituals. For Theosophists, these included Gnostic sacrifice and eugenics to achieve their ideal Superman. Hitler, the consummate eugenicist, and his inner circle were deeply into the occult. Hitler himself had been a member of the Thule Society and took its swastika symbol for his own. It is reported that he kept a copy of Blavatsky's writings at his bedside. He would give credit to American eugenicists, particularly the passing of the great race author Madison Grant, for being instrumental in his quest to develop the pure Aryan.
Charles Londonderry's contacts with the Nazis do seem to have been a genuine attempt to prevent war. But some die-hard aristocrats did have fascist sympathies. The Duke of Northumberland founded The Patriot, an anti-Semitic newspaper, and Lord Redesdale maintained that Hitler was a right-thinking man. The patriotism of fascism appealed to some landowners, and the British Union of Fascists was founded by another aristocrat, Sir Oswald Mosley.
In the 1930s, an influential segment of high society in both Britain and America actually admired and supported Hitler's National Socialist transformation of Germany. Their perception of Hitler before the war paralleled the favor among occultists for the pre-Hitler swastika as a beneficial symbol for those who would utilize its power. One of those admirers of Hitler in America was Thomas J. Watson Sr., founder of International Business Machines, IBM. Watson was an advocate of eugenics and population control, not unlike modern philanthropists Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who have supported China's brutal one-child policy and other population control measures throughout the world. Watson met with Hitler in 1937 and actually provided Hitler with the primitive computers that allowed the Nazis to number and account for each person in the Jewish population. The numbers on the arms of the Jewish Holocaust victims were IBM computer numbers. That notorious chapter in IBM's history is not well known, but IBM is not ashamed of its founder. The famous computer that recently competed on the game show Jeopardy was an IBM model named Watson. Today, IBM is still one of the leading providers and promoters of identity management solution technology for the global population. Others in the American and British establishment elite were not left out of the eugenics Hitler love fest. Joining Watson in his meeting with Hitler were the president and board members of the International Chamber of Commerce, an organization that today is a leading advocate of the multilateral trade framework that has been the basis for regionalization. E. Roland Harriman's Union Banking Corporation and partner director George Herbert Walker's son-in-law, Prescott Bush, grandfather of two presidents, were cited in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and the corporation's assets and shares were seized for acting as phantom holders of German industrialist and Hitler financier Fritz Thyssen's American assets. The Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Harrimans, financiers of the early 20th century eugenics programs in America, Britain, and Germany, were also prominent in the Roundtable CFR movement and were supporters of initiating the Federal Reserve central banking system in the U.S. In Britain, King Edward's 1936 abdication and virtual lifetime exile was not due merely to his marriage to Wallis Simpson, but to his widely known fondness for Hitler's fascism. Edward's sentiment was not necessarily an anomaly in British royalty, however. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and husband of Queen Elizabeth, head of the Commonwealth of Nations, has some Nazi eugenic skeletons in his closet as well. All four of his sisters married German officers, including one that married an SS colonel who named his eldest son Karl Adolf after Hitler. This intermingling of British and German aristocracy should not be surprising when it is considered that the modern British royal dynasty began in 1840 when Queen Victoria married her first cousin, Prince Albert, Duke of Saxe-Coburg in Germany. Her grandson, King George V, had been designated as an honorary German field marshal before World War I, but shed the title entering the war and began using the Windsor name. Granted, having family ties to German aristocracy does not make one a Hitler supporter, but Prince Philip's views on population control and the culling of excess humans are no less chilling and demented than a Nazi rally. In the foreword to the book, If I Were an Animal by Fleur Cowles, Prince Philip wrote, "I just wonder what it would be like to be reincarnated in an animal whose species had been so reduced in numbers that it was in danger of extinction. What would be its feelings toward the human species whose population explosion had denied it somewhere to exist? I must confess that I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus. Such is the mindset and character of the present movement to integrate the entire planet into a monopolist, fascist, population-controlled, occult New World Order of regions. Lying beneath the surface of human existence for ages, this agenda has proliferated within the past century into a blatant arrogance against any who would question the movement's godlike authority. In the 1960s, a predominant view among Bible expositors was that when the European Common Market reached a total of 10 Western European nations, the time would be right for the fulfillment of the Bible prophecies concerning the 10 kings. Now, roughly 50 years later, the European Union has grown to 28 member nations, and those Bible teachers' inadvertent lesson is clear. When it comes to interpreting current events with Bible prophecy, one must take care not to be too dogmatic. That 60s interpretation taught another lesson as well, that of misdirection and distraction. For while many had been focusing on developments in Europe, a larger global scenario has now emerged. It is a scenario that appears more consistent with the biblical narrative of a transformed beast that shall devour the whole earth, than does one that is just limited to reviving its former Roman Empire perimeter. It is a scenario that sees Europe not as being comprised of 10 kingdoms, but sees Europe itself as being one of the 10, albeit the most prominent among them. As has been shown, the current global regional network is undoubtedly Eurocentric, and is being developed through European old money sources. The European Union is the model that all other geopolitical regions in the world are emulating. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, institutions that have underwritten regional development throughout the world, are both of European stock, with the IMF directed by the Europeans and the World Bank by Americans, mostly descendants of Europe. The global promoter of regionalization, the United Nations, is funded disproportionately by its cash cow, the United States, and billions of U.S. foreign aid dollars have also been granted to regions for this agenda. Of course, China has become another major contributor to the cause of regionalization, but China's rise was enabled by Western investment. Despite its perceived rivalry with the United States, China has also become the West banker and finds itself in a manufactured interdependence with Western consumers, as well as with Western corporations investing, operating, and manufacturing in China. But it is the European Union itself that has become China's too-big-to-fail project, even as China slowly backs away from the US dollar, in large part because the dollar is a national currency, while the euro is regional. A Chinese official has even said that saving the euro is akin to saving globalization, but no such statement has come forth concerning the dollar. Therefore, it is safe to say that Europe is ground zero for the world's current regionalization movement. Surely, Europa is riding this beast. Whether or not the present regional structure reflects the exact final alignment for the Bible's 10 kings does not diminish the reality of what we see developing today. But it does raise an important question. Why 10? Why, after all of these centuries, since the 10 kings prophecies were put down in Scripture, would not random chance today allow any other number of major geopolitical regions to span the globe? More to the point, despite their open disdain for what they consider myths of the Bible, why is there such a blatant drive by its leaders to associate this movement with the great rebellion against the God of the Bible, as these illustrations indicate? Wouldn't normal people go out of their way to distance themselves from anything perceived as so authoritarian and nefarious? The answer is obvious. These are not normal people. What's worse, they don't consider themselves normal. They are the elite. Domination has been their business. They believe it is their divine right and destiny.
Begone, dull care. Fire shall have its will of thee. Begone, dull care. And all the winds make merry with thy dust. Hail, fellowship's eternal flame. Once again, midsummer sets us free.
How many people consider it normal to conduct Gnostic human sacrifice in effigy before a 40-foot idol, as many of these same elitists do every year at Bohemian Grove in California?
We beseech thee, grant us thy counsel.
We ran into David Gergen, the Karl Rove of 4 presidential administrations.
Listen, I am a happy member of the Bohemian Grove. I like the folks who come there, and it's really inappropriate for me to talk about the group beyond that. Thank you.
Have you been there for the ceremony with the cremation of care?
Frankly, I don't think that's something I need to talk to you about.
Really?
That's right.
Well, I'm Alex Jones, and I snuck in there in 2000. I'm the guy that blew it wide open and got the video. It's been on national TV.
Well, I disrespect you for that. That was not a gentlemanly thing to do.
But what about the ritual? Is the ritual genuinely?
Sir, everything I don't owe you this comment.
I know. I appreciate it.
This is what's called ambush journalism, and I disrespect you for that as well. So thank you
ever
and goodbye.
been in the ritual?
That's none of your damn business.
This naturally brings up yet another question. Why is it that such mantras as "ye shall be as gods" and the perfectibility of man, ideas that have been so clearly associated with the mystery religions, secret societies, and the Enlightenment ever since the biblical narrative of Adam and Eve, are now equally associated with this current movement? That consideration brings us back to the original question. Is the world's emerging New World Order of regions being built to accommodate the appearance of the 10 kings of Daniel and Revelation in the Bible? In the revelation of Jesus Christ, the Apostle John wrote, "Blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand." John and the prophet Daniel wrote much of their scripture text about the actions of governments, and much of the entire Bible concerns narratives and lessons about government's interaction with humanity under the authority of God. Why then do so many of today's Christians believe it is somehow not their spiritual responsibility to become aware of, and to reprove, this present end run around national sovereignty that openly displays all the characteristics of the great rebellion against their God and the Lord Jesus Christ?